Hello, everyone. Tonight, we're going to drift together into a story that still echoes with questions no one has been able to answer. Imagine walking through a silent forest in the middle of a Siberian winter, the air sharp enough to sting your lungs, snow swallowing your footsteps before you even realize you've made them. You reach a building large and once full of voices, but now nothing. Doors creak open to empty corridors, chalk still smeared on the blackboard, soup bowls half full on long tables, steam frozen in midair, and yet no children, no teachers, not even the sound of a chair scraping. A school once alive, now nothing more than a husk. A disappearance this large should have left chaos, broken windows, signs of escape, a fight, or at least some trace of struggle. Instead, everything feels carefully paused, like the entire community just stood up and walked away. A vanished school, a vanished town within itself, a vanished choir of voices silenced in the snow. And here's the cold fact check you need entire groups of people have vanished in history. In 1590, the Roanoke colony in North America was found, deserted houses intact, crops abandoned with only the word Croatoan carved on a post. In 1959, the Dyatlov Pass incident saw 9 young hikers found dead under bizarre, unexplained circumstances in the Ural Mountains, some without clothes, some with crushed bones but no external wounds. Human history carries these scars of vanishing. And tonight, we're opening one more. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you really like what I'm doing here. Also, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop it in the comments, city, country, maybe even what you do during the day. You never know, there might be someone watching this very same story just a few streets away from you. Now turn off the lights, lie back on your comfy cushions, and let's get moving tonight. The boarding school was called simply Internat 37, built during the Soviet era as a place for children of factory workers. It sat about 50 kilometers from the nearest settlement, a squat complex of concrete buildings softened by the surrounding pines. To the west ran a frozen rivers, and to the east stretched an endless sea of snowbound taiga. Winters there weren't seasons, they were prisons. For months, temperatures stayed well below freezing winds, carved the walls like knives, and the only lifeline to the outside world was a single road that often vanished beneath snowdrifts. Still, for decades, the school functioned. Children studied, played, sang in the choir their teachers proudly led. Photographs still exist, faded black and white groups of children bundled in coats, teachers smiling stiffly, banners of achievement hanging behind them. Nothing remarkable, nothing threatening, just the ordinary life of a rural school. Then came January 1965. The first sign of trouble was the silence. The bus driver who normally delivered supplies each week arrived at the compound gates and found them open. Inside, not a soul. He honked, he shouted. No reply. He walked into the cafeteria and froze at what he saw, trays of breakfast steaming when they should have been long cold, as if people had left moments earlier. A clock on the wall ticked normally. Books sat open on desks. A ball still rested at the foot of the gym wall, as if dropped mid-game, but there were no people. Authorities were called from the district town. Police soldiers, local volunteers trudged through snow into the compound. They searched every classroom, every dormitory. Beds were made shoes neatly aligned. In the headmaster's office, papers lay stacked pens, uncapped one mid-sentence note still drying on the page. The strangest detail. All the coats, boots, and gloves of the children remained in the cloakroom. No one had dressed for the cold. That night, the investigation began. Floodlights illuminated the grounds, their beams cutting through frost haze. The search team spread across the frozen forest, dogs sniffing, men shouting names into the darkness. Nothing but wind replied. And then they found it, the trail, bare footprints, hundreds of them, leading away from the school into the snow. Children's feet, teachers' feet, overlapping, intermingling, as if the entire population had left together calmly in a line. Some prints still sharp, preserved by the cold, others already half filled with falling snow. No sign of panic, no sign of struggle, just a procession into the endless white. This was not the kind of case Siberian authorities were trained for. They knew wolves, they knew bandits, they knew the dangers of cold. But this, an entire school gone, leaving only their footprints in snow, it made no sense. Even the most hardened investigators muttered prayers under their breath as they examined the trail, as though the forest itself had swallowed the children whole. There's a phrase that investigators and detectives are still debating whether to use when describing this collective disappearance. Some argue it sounds too supernatural, too much like folklore. Others insist there's no other way to describe it when dozens of people vanish in unison. What happened here was no accident of one or two runaways. This was a mass event. An unusual detail from early reports, one searcher swore he heard faint singing when he paused to listen near the tree line, a chorus of young voices, soft almost like a lullaby. His comrades laughed it off, saying the wind was playing tricks, but he was so certain he later refused to rejoin the search at night. The forest doesn't want us in there, he said. Back at the compound, investigators documented everything. They filmed the deserted halls with grainy Soviet cameras. They photographed the abandoned meals. These images, stored in archives, have only recently been released, and they show exactly what was described: a place frozen midlife, a sudden pause button pressed on reality. And here's where the dread really settles. The disappearance wasn't noticed immediately by neighbors because there were no neighbors. The school stood isolated, which meant whatever happened could have been going on for hours, maybe days, before the supply bus stumbled on it. By then, any chance of finding the people alive had already begun to slip away into the cold. The next morning, search parties widened the hunt. Helicopters hovered overhead, their rotors scattering snow. The footprints extended further than expected, leading away like a frozen ribbon into the pines. But what lay at the end of that trail, no one could have imagined, because the footprints did not stop, they multiplied. The snowstorm struck that night with a force that rattled every window pane of the abandoned school. Search teams huddled inside classrooms, their breath visible in the freezing air lanterns, casting long shadows against chalkboards scrawled with half-finished lessons. Some men refused to sleep, convinced the howling wind carried voices, children's voices, rising and falling like a choir rehearsing far away. Others laughed nervously, dismissing it as tricks of exhaustion. Still few dared leave their posts near the stoves. By dawn, the storm cleared, and what it left behind was even more unsettling. Fresh footprints, not the ones frozen days ago, but new tracks circling the school building itself. Dozens of small, bare feet pressed into the snow, looping around the cafeteria, the dormitories, even the bus still parked at the gate. But here's the detail that froze everyone's blood. No one had seen them appear. The prints hadn't been there before the storm. They had appeared during the night while soldiers stood guard. An investigator photographed them furiously, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the camera. Another soldier bent down and measured the prints. "Children's feet," he muttered, "the same as before, but they're warm. Look." He pressed his palm into one of the impressions and it came up damp with melted ice. The footprints were fresh. Suddenly the theory shifted. Maybe the children weren't gone. Maybe they were still out there, circling the investigators, unseen, watching. The following day, reinforcements arrived, higher-ranking officers from Moscow, accompanied by scientists. They brought dogs, maps, and equipment. Officially, the explanation given to locals was a missing persons operation. Unofficially, soldiers whispered about curses, ghosts, and ancient forest spirits. The scientists, for their part, tried to remain rational. They proposed mass hysteria, a phenomenon where groups of people influence each other into irrational behavior. But the soldiers shot back. Hysteria doesn't leave fresh footprints in a snowstorm. One scientist suggested checking the water supply for contamination. Wells were tested, samples taken. but results showed nothing unusual. No toxins, no bacterial outbreaks, no hallucinogens. Another proposed checking food stores. Again, nothing. Everything was normal. And then came the discovery that shattered what little rationality remained. A patrol searching further into the forest returned with something in their arms, a small child's jacket. It was frozen stiff, but inside the lining was a folded piece of paper, not official, not typed, handwritten, the ink smeared by dampness, but still legible. It read, "We go where the song is strongest. Don't follow." That night, morale collapsed. Soldiers began refusing to go on patrol after dark. One officer claimed he saw figures moving just beyond the tree line, dozens of them, but when his comrades rushed out with lanterns, the snow was untouched. Another swore that while standing watch, he felt a tug on his coat, like a child's hand pulling him toward the forest. He turned, but no one was there. Strange details piled up. Radios crackled with interference whenever the antenna was pointed east toward the clearing where the footprints had circled. Dogs refused to go near that direction, whining tails tucked. And in the cafeteria, a cook who volunteered to stay behind swore he found a tray of food missing from the counter, though no one admitted touching it. There's a legitimate historical echo worth noting here. In 1937, in a remote Soviet labor camp near Yakutia, dozens of prisoners were reported missing after a snowstorm. Guards found their barracks, abandoned beds, neatly made boots left behind. The only trace was a long line of footprints leading into the forest, never returning. Official records called it an escape attempt, but no bodies were ever recovered. Historians today debate whether it was mass suicide, starvation-induced madness, or something far stranger. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Internat 37 was simply a repetition of that pattern or something new entirely. By the fifth day, tensions boiled over. One group of officers wanted to call off the search, fearing the forest itself was claiming lives. Another insisted on pushing deeper, following the second trail of footprints east. Moscow demanded results. Orders were given, assemble a final expedition into the taiga. It would consist of 12 men, 6 soldiers, 3 scientists, 2 local trackers, and 1 officer to oversee. They would leave at dawn, armed with rifles, lanterns, and sleds, their mission to follow the trail until they found definitive answers or bodies or both. The men gathered in the gymnasium that night preparing. The chalkboard still bore half a sentence in Russian, "We must learn." The rest was smudged. Someone joked bitterly, "We must learn what killed them, maybe." No one laughed. When dawn came, the expedition set out. Snow crunched beneath their boots, the cold air so sharp it cut lungs. The footprints were easy to follow, a path pressed into the snow like a guide, straight ahead into the forest. Hours passed. The trees grew denser shadows, lengthened silence pressed down heavier with every step. Then, without warning, the dogs began barking furiously, tugging at their leashes, refusing to continue. The trackers muttered to each other in Evenki, their voices trembling. And that's when they saw it. The forest opened into a clearing unlike the first. Here in the middle of nowhere stood a structure, not modern, not Soviet, something older, a wooden frame rising from the snow like the skeleton of a long-forgotten building. Its beams were charred black, half collapsed as though it had burned centuries ago. Around it, the snow was littered with bones. Animal bones mostly, but mixed among them unmistakably were human remains. And at the heart of the ruins, carved into one of the surviving beams, was a symbol, a circle with 3 lines radiating outward, primitive, haunting, and almost identical to the drawing found in the headmaster's office. The expedition leader muttered under his breath, "What is this place?" No one answered, because just then a sound rolled through the trees. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. Children's voices, singing. The search party followed the footprints deeper into the forest, the cold biting at their cheeks, their boots crunching against the snow. What unsettled them most wasn't just the number of prints, it was their neatness. Rows upon rows of bare feet, small and large, walking together as if guided. They weren't scattered or chaotic like people fleeing in panic. They were aligned, almost choreographed, a silent march into the taiga. Investigators paused often, bending down to study the impressions. Some prints were tiny, belonging to the youngest children, their toes pressed so sharply into the snow, it was painful to imagine the frostbite they must have endured within minutes. Others were adult-sized, likely teachers or staff, no footwear, no boots, just skin against ice. The question clawing at everyone's mind, why would an entire group abandon warmth, food, and clothing to walk barefoot into Siberia's jaws of winter? One officer muttered that the pattern reminded him of ancient pilgrimage routes he'd seen in old manuscripts, rows of believers walking in ritual unity. That stray remark was quickly dismissed. Yet as they walked, the eerie uniformity gnawed at them. They expected the trail to stop at some point, a clearing, a camp, maybe even bodies frozen together. But the footprints didn't stop. Instead, they forked. One set of trails curved north toward the river while another set veered east deeper into the forest. Investigators split teams, leaving markers behind. The first group reached the riverbank within an hour. The ice was fractured in jagged lines as though something had broken through. No bodies floated, but dozens of footprints ended right at the edge, disappearing beneath the ice sheet. The river was silent, black beneath its crust. The eastward team fared no better. Their trail led to a clearing where the snow was disturbed in wide circular patterns, like people had gathered there, moving around in concentric rings. In the center, strange shapes had been pressed into the snow. Some claimed they were geometric circles within circles, spiral like. Others insisted it was random trampling, but the photograph later showed patterns too symmetrical to ignore. One strange detail stood out in the clearing. Searchers found several personal belongings: a mitten, a child's scarf, a pair of eyeglasses, but no blood, no signs of violence, just items left behind like offerings. And then came the most disturbing discovery. At the far edge of the clearing stood a small wooden shrine. Locals would later identify it as an obo, a sacred cairn traditionally built by indigenous Siberian groups as a place to honor spirits of the land. Investigators photographed it carefully, stones stacked, high ribbons tied to surrounding trees, a few coins scattered at the base. The problem: none of the children or staff should have known about it. These shrines were far from common knowledge in Soviet schools where religion and native traditions were discouraged, even punished. Yet here it was standing at the very place where the footprints converged. Investigators debated fiercely. Was this where the group stopped voluntarily? Did they worship? Did they wait? Or did something happen to them here? By the third day, panic spread among the authorities. The search party was exhausted, the freezing winds worsening. Theories flew: food poisoning leading to hallucinations, a mass psychotic break, perhaps even an escape plan gone horribly wrong. But none explained why they would leave in perfect order, barefoot into lethal cold. One officer, a veteran of war, wrote in his notes, "This is not normal human behavior. It is as if they were called." The villagers from the nearest settlement, when finally questioned, offered their own whispered theory: the forest had claimed them. They spoke of ancient stories where entire groups wandered into the woods, lured by voices, never to return. These were tales the Soviets had long dismissed as superstition, yet here faced with the frozen evidence they began to carry weight. An unusual piece of history enters here. In the late 1800s, explorers in the Altai Mountains documented accounts of mass wanderings among isolated tribes, people abandoning their homes, possessions, and even children to walk into the wild. Sometimes they were found dazed and frostbitten, sometimes never. Scholars still argue whether these were episodes of ergot poisoning from contaminated grains, collective hysteria, or something more spiritual. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether what happened at Internat 37 belonged to that same strange lineage. But what unsettled them most was that this wasn't just adults, it was children, dozens of them, back in the abandoned school. Military officers set up headquarters, poring over documents, interviewing former staff from nearby towns. Records revealed no signs of discontent, no letters hinting at rebellion, no secret religious movements, nothing unusual at all, except one. In the headmaster's drawer, beneath layers of official paperwork, a single sheet of paper was found. It was a crude drawing made in charcoal, a circle of figures holding hands surrounding a dark shape in the center. Their faces were blank ovals. Beneath it, scribbled in a child's handwriting, "He calls us." The note was bagged as evidence. Some officers dismissed it as a child's imagination. Others weren't so sure. The combination of the footprints, the ritual like clearing, and the drawing built a picture none of them wanted to admit. Whatever led the children into the forest wasn't human, or if it was something hidden far beyond the reach of Moscow's rational explanations. The snow began to fall harder, erasing what little trail remained. If answers were out there, they were disappearing by the hour. Yet the sense of dread only grew, because the more the investigators searched, the more it seemed like the forest was watching them back. The men froze where they stood, rifles half raised, every nerve straining. The sound came again, an airy, high-pitched chorus weaving in and out of the trees like smoke. It wasn't just random noise, it was melody, simple, repetitive, like a lullaby, hummed by unseen mouths. One of the soldiers whispered, "It's them. It has to be them." His words hung in the air, steam drifting from his lips, but no one dared reply. The expedition leader ordered silence. They crouched low, listening. The singing seemed to circle the clearing, never staying in one place. Sometimes it grew louder, as if right behind them, then faded, echoing from deep within the forest. The local trackers exchanged anxious looks and muttered something in Evenki. When pressed, one reluctantly explained, "Voices of the lost. If you follow, you don't come back." Despite their fear, the group pressed on. The ruined wooden structure beckoned, its charred beams cutting black shapes against the white snow. They stepped carefully, crunching through drifts, rifles at the ready. The closer they came, the stranger it felt, like the temperature had dropped 10 more degrees in a matter of steps. Breath hung heavier, shadows seemed darker. Even the snowflakes drifting down felt slower. They examined the bones first. Most were small animals, fox-hair birds, but there were larger fragments too. Femurs, ribs, cracked skulls, half buried in ice. The scientists hurriedly documented them, sketching, taking measurements. One muttered, "This is not a Soviet site. This predates it. Old, very old." And then something caught their eye. In the ash-black timbers, just beneath the strange carved symbol, faint letters were etched. Not Cyrillic, not Russian, something older, more angular. They copied it down to examine later. But one of the locals, staring at the shapes, paled visibly. "It says return," he whispered. "Return to the ash." Before anyone could react, the singing swelled. This time it was louder, unmistakable. Children's voices, dozens, strong, filling the clearing with haunting harmony. The men spun around, rifles aimed, but the trees were empty. Nothing moved. The dogs whined and pulled against their leashes' tails between their legs, desperate to flee. And then footprints appeared. Not old ones, not half buried by snow, fresh, right before their eyes, in the untouched white indentations pressed down as if invisible children were walking in a line. One by one, they appeared, heading straight toward the ruins. The men gasped, some crossing themselves despite Soviet discipline. One soldier broke. "No more," he shouted, slinging his rifle onto his shoulder. He sprinted toward the line of prints, following them as if desperate to prove they weren't real. The leader screamed after him, but the man was already gone, swallowed by the trees. His footprints, real ones, merged with the phantom ones, and then vanished completely. Panic rippled through the group. Half wanted to retreat immediately. The others argued they couldn't return to headquarters empty-handed. Moscow demanded answers, not superstition. The leader clenched his jaw and ordered them to press on. They set up camp in the clearing that night against their better judgment. Lanterns glowed dimly under makeshift tents. Fires were lit, but the warmth barely touched them. The singing continued faintly all night long, just beyond the tree line, a lullaby that scraped against sanity. Sometime past midnight, one of the scientists woke to scratching, not outside, but inside his tent. He grabbed his flashlight and froze. Across the canvas wall, tiny handprints pressed against the fabric, dozens of them, small, childlike. He screamed, waking the others, but when they rushed over, the prints were gone. By morning, exhaustion hung heavy. One man was missing, the soldier who had vanished into the phantom footprints the day before. No trace of him remained, only his rifle standing upright in the snow, leaning against nothing. The team prepared to retreat, morale collapsing. But before they left, one scientist insisted on taking a rubbing of the carved symbol on the beam. He pressed paper against it, traced the lines with charcoal, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his coat. They turned to leave, trudging back toward the direction of the school. But when they checked their compass, panic spread again. The needle spun wildly, unable to settle. Landmarks they swore they had passed before were gone. The forest looked unfamiliar, alien, endless. And then came the final blow. As they struggled to orient themselves, they stumbled upon another clearing. But this one wasn't ancient. It was fresh. Snow had been trampled in the same spiral patterns as before, circles within circles. And at the center lay objects the scientists recognized immediately: textbooks, school uniforms, children's shoes, all frozen, stiff, half buried in frost, but no bodies. An unusual detail: one textbook lay open, its pages stiff with ice. The last words written in a child's scrawl: "We are learning. He teaches us to walk in circles." The team realized they weren't just following footprints, they were walking in someone else's lesson. And as they huddled together, terrified, the singing began again, closer now, louder until it seemed to come from every direction at once. The singing swelled until it rattled the air itself, rising and falling like waves. The men stood shoulder to shoulder in the clearing lanterns, swinging wildly as beams of light swept over trees that revealed nothing but snow. Yet the voices, high, delicate, and relentless, seemed to circle them closer and closer, as though the forest itself was full of invisible children. One soldier clapped his hands over his ears and shouted, "It's inside my head." Another dropped his rifle and bolted into the trees, disappearing within seconds, his panicked screams drowned by the choir. The rest of the team was paralyzed, caught between terror and duty. The officer barked orders to regroup, to retreat, to move. They stumbled back toward the path they believed led to the school, dragging the dogs whose whines had risen to a shrill pitch. Every step felt heavier, every breath harsher. The air had grown so cold it seemed to freeze inside their throats. Then silence. The singing stopped, cut off mid-note, leaving only the creak of trees under frost. The abrupt absence was worse than the noise, an oppressive void pressing in from every side. The men stopped in their tracks, holding their breath. That's when they noticed something new. On the snow ahead of them lay a row of objects. At first glance, they looked like lumps of ice, but as lantern beams swept over, horror spread through the group. They weren't lumps at all. They were dolls, hand-sewn, primitive, made of rags and straw. Dozens of them lined up neatly across the snow like a barrier. Each doll had a stitched mouth, and each wore tiny fragments of real fabric, pieces unmistakably torn from school uniforms. One of the scientists knelt, his gloved hands trembling as he picked up a doll. Inside its body, stuffed where straw should have been, he found something stiff. Pulling it free, he revealed a photograph, faded, cracked, but clear enough to show a group of children smiling for the camera in front of the school building. And in the back row, just barely visible, was a man none of the investigators recognized. Tall, dark coat face, blurred slightly as if the camera lens had resisted capturing him. The scientists dropped the doll, and it landed face first in the snow. The group pressed forward, pushing past the dolls. Behind them, the forest groaned like it was alive, branches snapping in the distance, though no wind blew. Each step forward became a desperate attempt to escape, to reach familiar ground. But the deeper they went, the more it felt like the trees themselves rearranged. Trails looped back, landmarks repeated. They were trapped in a maze. Historical fact. In 1933, Soviet geologists exploring near Yakutsk reported geographic anomalies in the taiga areas where compasses failed, landmarks seemed to shift and distances stretched unnaturally. Some documents described it as a magnetic fog, though modern historians argue it was likely exhaustion combined with extreme weather. Still, the descriptions are eerily similar to what the team now faced. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether what happened next was psychological collapse or something far beyond science. After hours of wandering, they emerged not into the safety of the road, but into yet another clearing. This one larger, brighter moonlight reflected on ice so strongly it hurt their eyes. In the center of the clearing stood a tree. Unlike the surrounding pines, it was completely black charred from top to bottom, though it had never burned. Its branches reached outward like skeletal arms, and hanging from those branches, swaying gently, were dozens of the ragdolls they had seen earlier. The soldiers raised rifles instinctively as though ready to shoot at fabric, but one of the scientists whispered, "Look closer! The dolls weren't just dolls. Interwoven with straw and cloth were bones, small ones, finger bones, teeth." Panic erupted. One man vomited into the snow. Another began firing his rifle wildly into the trees, bullets cracking the stillness before his comrades dragged him down. The officer, pale and shaking, shouted to retreat, to get away from the cursed place. But just as they turned, a sound cut through the forest again. Not singing this time, laughter, childish, playful, echoing across the clearing, and as they froze, they saw movement. Tiny figures darted between the trees, too fast for lantern beams to catch. Shadows of children, their outlines flickering in and out like film stuttering on a projector. Dozens of them circling the men, closing the distance. One of the trackers fell to his knees, muttering prayers in Evenki. The dogs snapped and growled, barking at shadows they couldn't pin down. The laughter grew louder, sharper, until it filled the clearing like static. Then, without warning, every lantern went out at once. The darkness was absolute. The laughter stopped. And in that suffocating silence, something whispered just above the snow. Class begins. The darkness was suffocating. Without the lanterns, the only light came from the pale shimmer of moonlight, barely enough to outline the snow. The men stumbled together, rifles raised, breathing ragged, straining to hear anything beyond the pounding of their own hearts. Then the whisper came again, clearer, as though spoken by a teacher standing at the head of a classroom. Class begins. The sound didn't echo, it pressed against their ears, low and commanding, and immediately the forest responded. Footsteps, dozens of them, began circling the clearing. Snow crunched softly all around, forming an invisible perimeter. The soldiers aimed their rifles into the dark, but saw nothing. The dogs went mad, snarling and yelping, until suddenly they fell silent tails, tucked so far they looked broken. The officer barked an order to fire. A dozen gunshots ripped through the trees. The muzzle flashes illuminated only brief glimpses, white snow, black trunks, and just for a heartbeat, shapes. Small shapes, children, standing still among the trees, their eyes reflecting the firelight like animals, and then the darkness swallowed them again. When the echoes faded, silence returned, not even the wind moved, and then voices, not laughter, not singing, reciting. In unison, the sound of children chanting, "One step, two step, circle wide, he will teach us how to hide." The chant repeated faster each time, as if building towards something. The ground trembled faintly. A vibration felt through the soles of their boots. One of the scientists dropped his notebook and shouted over the noise, "It's ritualistic! It's some kind of—" He didn't finish. The snow beneath him caved like a trapdoor, and he vanished with a scream. The hole slammed shut instantly, leaving no trace. Only his dropped notebook remained, pages fluttering in the freezing air. Panic erupted. Men ran blindly in all directions, tripping over roots, slipping on ice, shouting names into the dark. But every direction they ran led them back to the same place, the clearing with the blackened tree. No matter which way they turned, the dolls swayed above their heads, whispering against each other in the wind that wasn't there. The officer, his composure shattered, dropped to his knees and clawed at the snow where the scientist had vanished. Nothing. Solid ground. He bellowed curses, his voice raw, but the chanting only grew louder. Circle wide, circle deep, walk the path, fall asleep. One of the soldiers snapped. He tore off his gloves, hands blue from the cold, and began stuffing snow into his mouth as if trying to silence the voices inside his head. Two others grabbed him, but it was too late. The chanting had broken him. His eyes glazed, and he slumped forward, muttering the rhyme in perfect unison with the unseen children. The officer made the decision, then retreat at any cost. He rallied the few who could still respond, forcing them into formation, dragging the broken soldier with them. They stumbled out of the clearing, half praying they would find the school, half praying never to see it again. For a time, the forest seemed to let them go. The chanting faded, the laughter died. Even the air felt lighter, though still bitterly cold. They dared to believe they had escaped until they found the school. It rose out of the snow without warning, a silhouette against the moonlight. The building was impossibly intact. Wooden walls, upright windows unbroken, a bell still hanging above the entrance. Frost glazed its surface, but it looked as though it had been abandoned only yesterday. The officer froze. Every file, every report had described the school as burned, reduced to ash decades ago. Yet here it stood whole and waiting. The door creaked open on its own. Inside, faint golden light spilled across the snow, and from within they heard the faint murmur of children's voices. Not laughter, not chanting this time, recitation, a lesson. One of the scientists whispered, "It's impossible. It shouldn't be here." The officer clenched his jaw. "Moscow sent us for answers. We're going in." And so, against every instinct, screaming to run, the men stepped across the threshold. The air inside was warm, too warm, like stepping into spring. Their boots left wet prints on the wooden floorboards. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with classrooms, chalkboards, desks, everything pristine, untouched by time. And at the far end, they saw them, children, sitting neatly at desks, backs straight, hands folded. Dozens of them, all silent. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, their eyes too dark. None of them blinked. At the blackboard stood the teacher. He turned slowly as the men entered, his face hidden by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. His voice was calm, steady, and inhumanly deep as he spoke the words that froze every drop of blood in their veins. "You are late to class." The men stood rooted in place. Their rifles trembled in their hands, but not a single finger dared squeeze the trigger. The warmth of the hallway pressed against their skin, and the scent of chalk and polished wood filled their lungs, impossibly fresh for a school that should have been nothing but blackened ruins. The teacher's silhouette moved closer, his steps echoing softly. The hat cast his face in shadow, but his posture carried an unnatural authority, the kind that makes even grown men feel like children again. He raised a long, bony finger and gestured toward the nearest classroom door. It swung open by itself, hinges groaning, revealing rows of desks and more children seated in perfect silence. They turned their heads all at once, eyes locking on the soldiers. The officer finally found his voice. "This isn't real. None of this is real." The teacher tilted his head.
almost amused. "Everything is real here. You just don't belong in it." A soldier panicked. He lifted his rifle and fired. The shot cracked through the warm air, shattering a row of windows at the far end of the hall. The children didn't flinch. Instead, their mouths opened in unison and they began to hum, low and steady, a single droning note that vibrated into the men's skulls. The soldier who fired the shot dropped his weapon and clutched his ears, screaming, "Make it stop! Make it stop!" He stumbled back, tripping over his own boots until his body went limp and he collapsed in the center of the hallway. His eyes remained open, glassy, as the humming ceased. The children blinked once in perfect synchrony. The officer barked orders, trying to rally his men, but his commands echoed strangely, bouncing back at them in a dozen voices that weren't his own. The building itself seemed to be mocking him, repeating his words back like a cruel child. The teacher finally stepped forward into the light. His face was pale, stretched too tight over sharp bones, and his eyes, black as coal, reflected no light at all. His smile was thin and humorless. "You came to find what happened here," he said softly.
And you will, but first you must learn. The officer raised his pistol, aiming at the figure's forehead. His hand shook, but he pulled the trigger anyway. The bullet passed through the teacher's head without resistance, punching a neat hole in the wall behind him. The teacher's smile widened. Lesson one: bullets are useless here. The classroom doors slammed shut one by one, the sound reverberating through the hallway like gunfire. The warm air grew thicker, oppressive, making it hard to breathe. Then came the scratching. From inside each classroom, tiny fingernails dragged across wood, scratching the desks, the walls, the floors. The sound multiplied dozens, then hundreds of nails, etching unseen patterns. The officer felt the vibrations through the soles of his boots, like the whole building was alive beneath him. The scientist, who had remained silent until now, whispered almost to himself, "It's an echo. They're not children. They're recordings."
Memories burned into the wood and stone. The teacher turned his coal-black eyes on him. Very clever, but still wrong. The scratching stopped. The doors opened again, this time all at once. The classrooms were empty. Not a single child in sight. The desks, once filled with small bodies, now stood abandoned chalk dust coating their surfaces. Only one thing remained in each seat: a tiny wax doll, featureless except for crude marks scratched into their faces, where eyes and mouths should have been. The men stepped back instinctively, rifles raised again. But the dolls didn't move. They only sat there lifeless, until the teacher clapped his hands once. The dolls' heads turned in unison, and from their wax mouths a chorus of voices poured out, high-pitched, broken, overlapping. Dozens of children singing a song none of the men recognized. The melody was wrong off key, yet hypnotic, pulling them deeper into a rhythm their bodies began to mirror unconsciously. One soldier's head began to sway, another's lips moved, trying to form the words. The officer screamed at them to hold their ground, but his voice drowned beneath the music. The dolls rose from the desks. Their wax limbs cracked as they moved, but they moved nonetheless, jerky, unnatural, yet disturbingly fast. They shuffled into the hallway, hundreds of them, their song building echoing off the walls. The men opened fire. Bullets tore through the wax figures, shattering heads, breaking limbs. But each doll that fell simply reformed in the blink of an eye, wax flowing back into shape like melting candles in reverse. The teacher watched calmly as though amused by their futile resistance. Lesson 2: knowledge cannot be destroyed. It only reshapes. One of the soldiers, cornered against the wall, screamed and swung his rifle like a club, smashing dolls into the floor. But the wax surged up his arms, coating his hands, crawling over his skin like liquid.
His screams became muffled as the wax sealed his mouth shut, hardening until his body became just another doll. In the chorus, his eyes were the last part visible before the wax consumed them too. The officer grabbed the nearest scientist by the collar. "We're leaving now." But when he turned toward the door, it was gone. The entrance to the school had vanished, replaced by another endless hallway lined with classrooms. The teacher's voice followed them, calm and absolute. Lesson 3: there is no leaving until the class is dismissed. The dolls advanced their song, now deafening, as the men realized they were trapped in the school that should not exist. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly now, longer than any building had a right to be. Every step the men took forward only added more distance, more doors, more flickering lantern light. The dolls followed in perfect rhythm, their wax feet clicking against the floorboards like a metronome.
The officer barked orders, desperate to impose control. Eyes front, keep moving. Don't listen to his words faltered. The music was in him now, vibrating his teeth, pressing into his ribs. Even as he spoke, part of his mind began to hum along. One of the scientists stumbled, clutching his temples. They're inside our heads. It's resonance, like hypnosis through sound waves. His voice was shrill cracking. If we don't block our ears, he didn't finish. The doll surged forward, a tide of wax limbs pulling him down. His scream vanished under the chorus. When the wave receded, only another wax child stood where he had fallen, joining the song. The others pressed on, but the building itself betrayed them. Floors tilted beneath their boots, hallways twisted back into themselves. They burst into what they thought was an exit, only to find themselves back in the same corridor, the same desks, the same black-eyed teacher standing at the far end. "Class is eternal," the teacher intoned, voice like stone, dragged across stone. "The lesson never ends." The officer raised his pistol again, hands trembling, and emptied every round into the teacher's chest. The shots echoed but left no mark. The teacher didn't even flinch. Instead, he raised one long arm and pointed at the officer like a scolding parent. The officer's gun dissolved. Not dropped, not broken, dissolved, dripping from his hand in molten wax. He gasped as the burning liquid coated his palm, fusing skin to bone. The surviving soldier panicked and bolted into a side room. The others followed, slamming the door shut behind them. They were in a classroom. Desks lined the room neatly. Chalk dust coated the air. A lesson was still written on the board, though the letters crawled and shifted as if alive, never forming recognizable words. And at the back of the room, more children, not dolls, real children, or at least they looked real. Pale faces, dark eyes, hands folded neatly on desks. They didn't move until the officer stepped closer. Then, in eerie unison, their heads turned. "Sit down," they whispered together. The soldier shook his head violently, refusing, but his knees buckled anyway, like invisible hands forcing him into the nearest chair. His back snapped upright, his hands folded automatically on the desk. His eyes went wide with horror, but his body didn't obey him anymore. The scientist tried to pull him out of the chair, but the wood groaned and tightened legs stretching like roots to bind the soldier in place. His mouth opened and he began reciting, voice flat, monotone. "Alien, 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times 4 is 16. 16 children sit in rows, rows and rows forevermore." The officer yanked him hard, but the body was already stiff, lifeless eyes locked forward. Another desk had claimed him. The scientist screamed, grabbing at his hair, muttering, "It's rewriting them. It's turning them into the lesson itself." The teacher appeared in the doorway, his shadow stretching impossibly long across the floor. "Knowledge requires sacrifice," he said. "You came to learn the truth. You will learn." The scientist snapped. He hurled himself at the blackboard, erasing the shifting letters with his bare hands. Chalk dust exploded into the air, burning his lungs. For a moment, the humming stopped. The dolls outside the door fell silent. Even the teacher's shadow paused. And then the words returned, carved directly into the wood, this time glowing faintly with heat, as though branded into the surface. Lesson never ends. The scientist coughed blood collapsing at the base of the board. His skin blistered where the chalk dust touched him. His eyes rolled back, and he whispered one final thought. It's not a school. It's a church. The officer, the last man standing, dragged himself back into the hallway. The dolls were waiting perfectly still, their eyes fixed on him. The teacher walked among them, hands clasped neatly behind his back like a conductor preparing an orchestra. He raised his hand, and the dolls lifted theirs in unison. The teacher's voice was calm, absolute. Final lesson, the dolls began to sing again louder, this time louder than before. The air vibrated, walls shook, glass shattered from the windows. The sound was no longer just in the ears, it pressed against organs, cracked bones, made blood vessels tremble. The officer dropped to his knees, screaming voicelessly as wax seeped from his ears and nose. His vision blurred. He saw the hallway stretching infinitely, filled with rows of children, all staring at him, every one of them mouthing the same words. Join the class, join the song, the school goes on. And then he saw the truth. Through the blinding pain, the officer realized these weren't just children from one village one time. They were all of them, generations of missing children swallowed by the school, pressed into its choir. Every disappearance, every mystery, they were here singing forever. His last thought before darkness consumed him was not of Moscow, nor of his orders, but of his own childhood. The memory of sitting at a desk, chalk squeaking, the smell of old wood, and the crushing certainty that he too had just become a student in the school that never ended. Snow hammered against the walls of the impossible school. Outside, the storm raged with a violence that bent trees and buried paths in minutes. Yet inside, the building remained perfectly warm, perfectly still, its corridors humming with the faint echo of voices long since gone. Days passed, though time inside was a slippery thing, refusing to obey natural rhythm.
Search parties sent after the soldiers and scientists never returned. Reports made it back to Moscow, of course, but always secondhand locals claimed to see flickers of lanterns in the woods or hear a chorus of children carried on the wind. Whenever reinforcements ventured closer, storms rose up without warning, swallowing them whole. And still in the cave, beneath the snowdrifts, evidence remained. It was there that a different team decades later, after the Soviet Union itself had collapsed, stumbled across something chilling. The cave mouth yawned open like the jaw of a frozen beast, its entrance blocked by layers of blue ice. Inside, expedition lights bounced off slick walls, throwing reflections that made it seem as though dozens of figures were following them, and in a way, they were. The walls bore hundreds of handprints, small ones, child sized, pressed deep into the ice as though melted there by heat. Their arrangement wasn't random. They formed lines, concentric rings, circles within circles, almost like seating charts, and the deeper they went, the stranger it became. At the heart of the cave was a massive chamber, cathedral like, with a ceiling so high it seemed to vanish into darkness. The acoustics were extraordinary. Every whisper echoed, multiplied, returned with an eerie delay, as though the cave itself answered back. And seated there, half buried in ice, were the children, not alive, not corpses in the usual sense. Their bodies were preserved perfectly, skin pale, but unblemished, clothing intact. Some wore winter coats, others simple school uniforms, though these had long since gone out of style. They sat in neat rows like obedient students waiting for instruction. Many still held hands. Their mouths were open, every single one, frozen mid-song. The expedition members argued about what they were seeing. Some insisted it was a natural freak of preservation, a mass death by cold, where the positions just happened to mimic order. Others shook their heads violently, pointing to the expressions carved into those faces, serene, almost joyful, as if singing brought them peace at the moment of death. One young historian whispered, What none of them wanted to hear, "It's a choir." They pressed, further documenting the scene when one member dropped his flashlight. It clattered across the ice, striking something hollow. When he picked it up again, his light fell on carvings in the wall, letters, words etched in multiple languages: Russian, Polish, Finnish, even fragments resembling ancient runes, and every phrase, no matter the tongue, carried the same message: lesson never ends. The team recorded as much as they could, their voices hushed despite themselves. The sheer scale of the chamber was overwhelming.
Hundreds of children sat preserved frozen mid-verse, their song long since lost to human ears. Yet the silence was deceptive. When the lead scientist played back his recordings later that night in their base camp, the audio revealed something impossible. They heard themselves speaking, their boots crunching on ice, their nervous laughter. But faintly, just beneath those sounds, came another layer, a whisper, a melody, children singing. The song was fractured, nearly inaudible, but it was there, a steady rhythm, voices in harmony. And worse, the scientists swore that none of them had heard it in person while inside the cave. It was only on the recording. That discovery fractured the group. Half of them wanted to leave immediately to destroy every tape and photograph. The others insisted they had stumbled upon one of the greatest archaeological mysteries in history. They stayed too long. The storm outside worsened, as if the forest itself conspired to hold them there. Tents collapsed under the weight of snow. Supplies dwindled, and through the howling wind at night, they began to hear it faint singing carried on the gale, matching perfectly the voices on their recordings. By the third night, one of them was gone. His bedroll lay empty, his boots still by the fire. Tracks led away into the storm, bare footprints vanishing into the snow. The historian broke down, scribbling in his journal, "By candlelight, they're not preserved. They're rehearsing. Every new voice makes them stronger." When rescuers arrived months later, they found only remnants of the camp, scattered notebooks, frozen tents, no bodies. The only thing left intact was a recorder, its tape still turning despite the dead batteries. It played a lullaby, children's voices soft and sweet. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the phenomenon could be explained by toxic gas released from melting permafrost, inducing hallucinations and mass hysteria. Others argue the acoustics of the ice chamber could create auditory illusions that mimic choirs, but none of those explanations accounted for the preserved bodies, nor the wax dolls later found among the ruins of the original school. What remained undeniable was this: the school had left its mark, etched into the land itself. Every attempt to erase it only seemed to feed the story. Every expedition ended in silence, and the lesson whispered across decades remained the same. The school goes on. The cave chamber had become a tomb, but not one of dust or decay. It was a sanctuary frozen in time, holding hundreds of children whose songs seemed to echo across centuries, and still no one could explain why. In the aftermath of the failed expeditions, governments quietly sealed records, classifying reports, and confiscating artifacts. Officially, the school incident never happened, yet whispers leaked out. A blurred photograph of pale faces half encased in ice.
An audio clip so faint it sounded like wind until you played it backwards, and the choir emerged singing in harmony. But sometimes the truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface. It was a local hunter who stumbled across the next piece of the puzzle. One bitterly cold February, he tracked a wounded elk into the forest. The storm forced him into shelter, a cave he didn't recognize. Inside, the walls gleamed with faint blue light as if alive, and in the silence he heard something he swore would follow him forever: children humming. He dropped his rifle and fled. When he returned to his village, his hair had turned white. Word spread as it always does. By the mid 2000s, the legend of the vanished school gained traction online. Forums filled with theories: alien abduction disguised as folklore, a Soviet psychological experiment gone wrong, a naturally occurring infrasound frequency, driving groups insane. And yet, the testimonies from locals all agreed on one strange detail. Anyone who ventured too close to the ruins, whether hunter explorer or curious tourist, always came back humming. Sometimes they didn't even realize they were doing it. A soft, tuneless melody under their breath, a lullaby with no origin. One journalist determined to document the phenomenon managed to reach the site with a small crew. They filmed everything: the frozen handprints, the preserved children in the ice, the eerie acoustics. On camera, they laughed nervously about the rumors, joked about cursed choirs. But when the footage aired later, a chilling discovery was made. In the background of every clip, faint but undeniable, was the sound of singing. None of them had heard it in person, and worse, viewers at home began reporting side effects, humming along unconsciously, strange dreams of sitting at desks in long hallways, even waking up in the middle of the night, standing barefoot on their floors, facing the corner of the room, as though waiting for instruction. Scholars scrambled to explain. Was it psychological suggestion, mass hysteria triggered by media, or something deeper woven into the frequencies of the recording itself? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether it was merely a viral hallucination or evidence of something real embedded in the sound waves. Meanwhile, one more unsettling clue surfaced. The journalist who filmed the documentary disappeared weeks later. His apartment was left untouched, laptop open, dinner half eaten, front door locked from the inside. Only one thing was out of place: a notebook on his desk, filled cover to cover with a single repeated sentence: lesson never ends. Neighbors swore they heard children singing in his apartment the night he vanished. Theories multiplied. Some insisted the school had grown stronger over the years, expanding its reach through recordings, photographs, even written words. Others argued it was never bound to the forest at all, but to the act of remembering, that the moment someone spoke or wrote of it, the classroom expanded, pulling new students into its ranks. If that was true, the danger was no longer confined to Siberia, because the stories kept spreading. Online forums, true crime podcasts, late night YouTube dives, each retelling carrying the hum a little farther. And with every retelling, more people began to hear it. A soft, steady chorus. Children singing in the background, just beyond the edge of perception. The question was no longer how the school vanished. It was how far the lesson could travel and how many students it would claim before anyone could stop it. By the time whispers of the vanished school reached Western academics, the story had already morphed into something much larger than folklore.
In 2015, a linguistics professor in Prague received a USB drive in an unmarked envelope. Inside were audio files labeled simply Choir 1, Choir 2, Choir 3. At first, they seemed like simple field recordings of wind blowing through a cavern, but when the professor ran the files through a spectrogram analysis, her blood ran cold. The waveforms formed letters, clear, deliberate characters etched into sound itself. Not Russian, not Latin, something older, ancient script resembling a hybrid of Proto-Norse runes and early Slavic inscriptions. She translated one fragment: class dismissed when silence falls. But silence never came. The professor, once skeptical, became obsessed. She played the recordings over and over, convinced the phrases changed slightly each time, as if the choir was adapting, rewriting itself in real time. Within months, her colleagues reported strange behavior. She hummed unconsciously during lectures.
She was caught standing in empty classrooms at night, arranging desks into perfect rows. Then one morning, she didn't show up for class. Her office door was locked, the windows barred from the inside. Authorities broke in and found her desk covered in papers, hundreds of copies of the same translation, written by hand, shakier each time. Lesson never ends. The USB drive was gone. At the same time, Reports from Siberia resurfaced. Hunters spoke of seeing children wandering the forest at night, barefoot, dressed in outdated school uniforms. When approached, they didn't run or speak. They simply pointed always in the same direction, toward the mountains where the frozen cave lay buried. One hunter swore he followed them. They moved in silence, he told a journalist, trembling. But when I turned my head, I heard them behind me, humming, closer and closer. He never hunted again.
Gotcha. Months.
Mites. The strangest clue came from a Moscow audio engineer who claimed to have restored one of the original Soviet recordings. He filtered the background noise, stabilized the pitch, and isolated what he believed was the pure version of the children's song. When he played it publicly at a private symposium, attendees reported dizziness, nausea, and uncontrollable tears. One man collapsed, clutching his ears, whispering, I remember the classroom. But here's the horrifying part. When the engineer stopped playback, the room didn't fall silent. The choir kept singing, clearer, louder, not through the speakers, but from the audience itself. Every single attendee was humming the melody in unison, though none claimed to remember doing it afterward. Investigators, folklorists, and intelligence agencies began asking the same terrifying question. Was the vanished school truly destroyed, or had it simply relocated, not in space, but in mind? What if the children preserved in ice weren't dead at all? What if they were only waiting, rehearsing their choir, growing stronger with each retelling of the story, each listening ear, each voice that unknowingly joined their chorus? One classified document leaked online contained a final warning scribbled by hand across the last page of a research file. Do not listen to the recordings. Do not write of the school. Every student added brings it closer. The lesson is not for them, it is for us. And in the audio attached to the leak, faint but undeniable, was the sound of children singing. Only this time their voices weren't in Russian. They were singing in English.
The school, once thought confined to myth and archival whispers, began to cross borders in ways no one expected. By 2017, urban legends circulated in Europe and South America about classrooms where students spontaneously began humming the same haunting melody. Teachers dismissed it as TikTok trends of viral earworm, but psychologists who studied the phenomenon noticed something chilling. Every report involved groups of exactly 30 children, never more, never less, and each group, when questioned, said the same thing: we heard the bell. A historian in Chile drew a disturbing parallel to the Armero tragedy of 1985, when a volcanic eruption buried a Colombian town beneath mud and ash. Survivors claimed to hear voices of children singing in the debris long after the rescue operations ended.
Investigators and detectives are still debating whether this was simply auditory hallucination caused by stress, the historian wrote, or something far more orchestrated. The number of missing students reported in that town's only school, 30. Back in Russia, fragments of declassified Soviet material revealed even darker truths. The original expedition that discovered the frozen cave had not been one, but three. The first two went unreported because none of the researchers survived. One scribbled note found in a frostbitten backpack read, "The children are not lost. They are rehearsing." Their teacher told them the world outside is the final exam. The chilling implication was that the choir wasn't an accident of history, it was an assignment. In 2019, a cultural anthropologist from Canada visited the region to collect first-hand accounts. He brought with him noise-canceling equipment designed to block frequencies believed to trigger auditory hallucinations. On the third night in the mountains, he set up camp near the cave site. Locals later recalled hearing faint echoes of singing across the valley that night. The next morning, the anthropologist's tent was found empty. His gear remained inside untouched. The audio recorder on his lap contained exactly 7 hours of sound, at first static, wind, then gradually a chorus of voices. But the voices weren't only children. Halfway through the recording, adults joined in, their tones deeper, more layered. Some sang in languages unrecognizable, but others sang names, the anthropologist's own name, repeated over and over until the track ended in absolute silence. Psychologists who reviewed the file claimed the progression of voices mirrored generational layering, as though the choir was expanding by age groups.
Children becoming adults, adults becoming teachers, teachers instructing the next wave of voices, which led one researcher to ask the most horrifying question of all: what if the missing never die? What if they just move into the choir, waiting for the next bell to ring? By 2020, the case reached the internet in the form of conspiracy forums where people began sharing eerie anecdotes. One post read, "My daughter said her substitute teacher smelled like snow. He asked them to sit perfectly straight, hands folded, and then he tapped the desk 3 times. They all hummed the same note. When I asked her what song it was, she said, 'It's the one you'll learn soon, mommy.'" The post was deleted within hours, but not before dozens of users claimed they had heard their own children humming the same tune in their homes. A strange academic debate erupted. Was this a mass psychogenic illness, a contagious folklore embedded in the psyche, or evidence of a genuine phenomenon? A Harvard paper suggested the songs triggered neurological entrainment, synchronizing brains the way metronomes align, but leaked field reports from Russian operatives suggested something worse. The choir was expanding faster. Each new generation of children who hummed the tune seemed to strengthen the phenomenon, as though the vanished school wasn't just surviving, it was recruiting. The scariest part: every single humming child described the same vision: rows of desks, chalk dust in the air, and a figure at the front of the classroom, back turned, writing on the board. When asked who the figure was, the children all gave the same answer: the teacher. And when pressed to describe his face, they all said the same thing:
He doesn't have one yet. The phrase, "he doesn't have one yet," sent ripples of dread through every investigator who encountered it, because the suggestion was clear: the teacher's identity was unfinished, waiting. By 2021, researchers in both Russia and Western Europe began noticing a terrifying pattern in the reports. In every case of children humming or adults whispering the tune, one individual in the group would begin to act differently: quiet at first, observant, writing compulsively, drawing classrooms, blackboards, rows of faces, and slowly their features seemed to fade from memory. Friends struggled to describe them in detail. Even family members hesitated when asked what their loved one's face looked like. They could still see them, yes, but the memory slipped like ash through their fingers. It was as though the teacher's faceless form was grafting itself onto the nearest human available. One chilling case surfaced in Poland. A middle school substitute teacher, described as unremarkable, began each lesson with 3 sharp taps on the desk. Parents noticed their children humming more often, staring into space, murmuring, "The bell is coming." When authorities arrived at the school to investigate, the classroom was empty. Every desk was in perfect order. The chalkboard was wiped clean, and 30 pairs of shoes were lined neatly by the door. The teacher was gone. The children were gone. Only one faint detail remained scrawled in dust on the window pane: "Lesson complete." Historical parallels began to emerge with frightening clarity. Medieval texts in Europe spoke of wandering choirs that vanished into forests. South American legends told of schools swallowed by mountains where teachers promised eternal education. Ancient Egyptian records described groups of 30 initiates disappearing during ritual chants, different continents, different eras.
Always the same number, always the choir. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether these were simply mass tragedies, misremembered as folklore, or evidence of one continuous phenomenon threading through history. By now, intelligence agencies couldn't ignore it. Classified reports indicated that the vanished school had appeared in refugee camps and disaster zones, and even in modern cities where surveillance footage showed something impossible. In one recording from a train station in Germany, 30 people, children, teenagers, adults, stopped moving simultaneously. They formed rows, stood perfectly still, and hummed in unison for exactly 60 seconds. Then, without warning, they dispersed. Later interviews revealed that none of them remembered doing it, but each had one identical phrase scribbled in their notebooks, calendars, or phones. Class continues.
The most horrifying breakthrough came when a linguist pieced together fragments of the humming from recordings across decades. When stitched into sequence, the melody revealed not just random tones, but a coherent hymn. And the lyrics, once reconstructed, sent a chill through every listener. The school has no walls, the teacher has no face. We are the lesson, we are the test. The implication became unavoidable. The vanished school wasn't a physical building. It wasn't buried in ice or destroyed by catastrophe. It was a moving structure, a mobile phenomenon assembling itself wherever 30 voices aligned in perfect unison. The choir wasn't trapped, it was multiplying, and every retelling, every listening ear, every skeptic who replayed the recording contributed to its spread because the school didn't need to be found. It was already here, waiting for the next bell.
The deeper researchers probed, the more it seemed the school had evolved into something viral, an infection of memory, sound, and ritual. By 2022, clusters of disappearances were no longer isolated in remote mountains or rural towns. They were happening in urban centers under full surveillance. One terrifying case unfolded in Sao Paulo, Brazil. A class of 35 students entered their school building at 7:45 a.m. Security cameras caught every child walking through the main doors, chatting, laughing, backpacks swinging. Teachers confirmed attendance during morning roll call. By 10:15 a.m., the classrooms were empty. Desks, pristine books, unopened chairs pushed neatly in. 35 students, 5 teachers, gone. Police swarmed the school, every window locked, every exit sealed. No sign of forced entry, no broken locks. CCTV footage showed the classrooms from multiple angles, yet at the exact same timestamp, the screens glitched to black for 60 seconds. When the feed returned, the rooms were vacant. The only clue was audio corruption caught by one of the cameras, a faint rhythmic tapping, 3 knocks, followed by humming, and beneath the static, barely audible, a voice in Portuguese, presente professor, present teacher. Forensic experts analyzing the case stumbled on an unsettling detail. When the footage was enhanced, a figure appeared faintly reflected in one of the classroom windows, a man-shaped shadow standing at the blackboard's shoulders, hunched writing, but the face was a blur, smeared as if the lens itself couldn't capture it. Once again, investigators and detectives are still debating whether this was a trick of light, a glitch in the digital feed, or the first recorded image of the faceless teacher. International organizations began classifying the phenomenon as a contagious disappearance event. Recommendations went out to schools across multiple continents. Do not allow students to hum in groups. Never permit synchronized tapping in classrooms. If 30 students assemble in one room, split the group immediately, but panic spread faster than reassurance. Videos circulated online of children humming the melody in playgrounds and cafeterias, even during virtual classrooms over Zoom. Once during an online session in the US, 30 cameras displayed students staring straight ahead, swaying slightly in rhythm. The teacher panicked, shut off her laptop, and reported the incident. But later, when investigators checked her device, the recording was gone. Only one file remained auto-saved by her microphone, the faint sound of chalk scraping across a blackboard. Scholars of folklore argued that this was no accident of history, but a recurring archetype, societies imagining the perfect school where lessons never end. But skeptics found their voices drowned out by mounting cases, because now disappearances weren't the only danger. Survivors began to emerge. Children who returned after vanishing, they were found wandering forests, city alleys, even highways, always in groups of 30, always barefoot, always whispering about the teacher. But they weren't the same. Their eyes seemed unfocused, their voices toneless, and when asked simple questions, what their names were, where they'd been, they all answered in unison, "We were in class." One psychiatrist in Berlin attempted a controversial experiment. He gathered 3 returned children and placed them in a soundproof room with an observer behind glass. He asked them to draw whatever they remembered. At first, they sketched crude desks and chalkboards. Then one child pressed their crayon to the paper and wouldn't stop, over and over, pressing harder until the paper tore. The word repeated again and again: attend, attend, attend. At that moment, the lights in the observation room flickered. The psychiatrist felt pressure in his ears like a low drone building in the air. And then the 3 children began to hum. Perfect pitch, perfect harmony. The psychiatrist screamed for the guards to stop the session, but when they entered, the children were silent, sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring blankly. The humming had stopped, but the guards had begun. Every single one of them was humming the same melody as they dragged the children away. The humming had become impossible to contain. By 2023, scattered reports converged into a horrifying realization: the vanished school was no longer confined to myths or isolated cases. It had gone global. Parents reported waking in the night to find their children sitting upright in bed, eyes open, whispering, "The bell has rung." Commuters on trains filmed strangers humming in sync, 30 at a time, until the entire carriage fell silent. In one chilling case, passengers disembarked and left their belongings behind in neat rows on the platform. None were seen again. Governments tried to control the panic. Official statements called it mass suggestion, a byproduct of social media hysteria, but leaked files told another story. Intelligence agencies admitted that nearly every major city had recorded an event. The terminology had shifted: not disappearance, not vanishing, but class assemblies, because these weren't random anymore. They followed a schedule. Every 33 days, somewhere in the world, 30 people disappeared simultaneously. Theories multiplied. Some scholars argued the faceless teacher was an emergent archetype, born from human need for structure, a collective hallucination. Others feared the opposite, that he was real, and his face was still forming piece by piece, stolen from those chosen to lead the class. The darkest theory suggested that humanity itself was the curriculum, that the vanished school wasn't a building, wasn't a legend, it was a machine of learning, consuming generations one row at a time. The final documented case hit too close to home. A remote learning session in New York connected 30 students via webcam. Parents sat nearby listening. At 10:00 a.m.,
The teacher's screen froze, static flickered, then slowly a figure appeared at the digital blackboard. Tall, indistinct shoulders curved, his hand moved with chalk. On every child's screen, words appeared scrawled in real time. You are all present. The lesson begins. Parents screamed, pulling their children away, slamming laptops shut. But afterward, none of the families could recall their child's exact face. They remembered laughter, voices, details, but not the image, like memory itself had been erased, and in the silence that followed, a faint sound lingered from the speakers, chalk tapping 3 times. The world stands at a precipice. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether these disappearances are mass psychosis, supernatural intervention, or the inevitable evolution of human myth into something living. But the facts refuse to be ignored. The school is expanding. The teacher is still faceless. The next bell is coming. And if the lesson is for us, then the only question left is, what are we supposed to learn? The story ends not with closure, but with a warning. Listen carefully. If you hear humming in unison, if you feel the pull of perfect order, if you sense the weight of a classroom forming in silence, do not answer roll call. Do not say present, because the school has no walls, and the teacher is waiting. The lights are dim now, the story drifting into silence, but the unease it leaves behind lingers like chalk dust in the air. You can almost smell it, the faint tang of classrooms long abandoned yet somehow still alive. Close your eyes and picture it, rows of desks, the faint scrape of chairs, the rhythm of 30 voices breathing in unison, a teacher whose face you cannot quite see, the sound of a bell you've never heard before, and yet it feels familiar, like you've been waiting for it all your life. That's the thing about mysteries like this. They don't end when the story does. They echo, they bleed into dreams, into stray thoughts, into those strange moments when you swear you've heard someone humming just behind you. But here's the comfort I can give you tonight: you are not alone. Every listener, every wanderer into the unknown carries the same burden.
The vanished school may be waiting, but the fact that we speak of it here together keeps it at bay just a little longer. So breathe deeply, let the weight lift from your chest. Remind yourself that the lights around you are real, that the silence you hear now is safe. And as you drift towards sleep, remember the school cannot take you unless you answer. Stay silent, stay unseen, and maybe, just maybe, the bell will pass you by tonight.